So we're going to do an example of getting invoices from QuickBooks to showing up under our account records in the CRM. And the way that we're going to do that is through something called a related list, a custom related list. Now, you probably already know about related lists in the CRM. Anytime you relate a deal to a contact or a contact to an account, you can go to that parent record and see in the related lists below any of those related CRM records. Well, you can do the same thing with third-party records, including those in QuickBooks, using a custom Deluge function. Today, I'm going to show you how you can get real-time QuickBooks data into the CRM under your records. Let's jump into it. If I come to my CRM here, I'm in the A Datum Corporation, and I've added a custom related list here labeled QuickBooks Invoices. And here you can see that I have my invoice number, the date, the total for the invoice, as well as the current invoice's balance. I even have these numbers are hyperlinks, so I can click on them and they will open up in my QuickBooks account so I can see and interact with that invoice directly. So first off, how do you get the related list to appear? The way you do that is coming over to the three dots here on your account record and select Add Related List. So you select that, and then we're going to write a function. So we're going to select this Functions option. Now, I already have my function written here, and I'm going to take you through that, but you would create a new function here to start one from scratch. Now, before we continue on with this, I do want to show you two help documents that we're going to be looking at while we're building our function. So over here on the left, I have from Zoho's help desk, adding custom related lists from their knowledge base on the CRM. And I'm going to scroll down here to third-party API as related lists. And here they show us what format we have to use in order to get that information to show up as that table with rows and columns. It's through something called XML, which is also known as an extensible markup language. That's just the particular language that Zoho is using for these custom related list functions, and this is what we're going to leverage here. So if we look over here, you can see that you open and close your list with a set of record tags, and then every row that you want represented on your table, you need to start with a row tag, and then the number that that row should appear in the order of the table. Then for every column that you want to see, we're going to add one of these FL tags with a value of our column name. Then in between this tag and the same closing tag, that's where we'll actually put our values. Then we repeat that process for each column, close that particular row with a row tag, then start the process over again with a new row tag, more field label tags with the different columns and their values, close it with a row tag, and then we close it with one more record tag. Now, something that we will also get into is that you can add link equals true and then a URL equals some URL to turn any value into a hyperlink, which is what I did to get those invoice numbers to be able to click and pull open the invoice record in QuickBooks itself. Okay, that's on the Zoho side. Then the other piece that we want to be able to reference is the APIs for QuickBooks itself. So that you get to by going to developer.intuit.com and looking up their API documentation. When you first get there, you'll probably be greeted with a page like this with a Get Started. You want to just click on API Explorer here and make sure you have QuickBooks Online selected rather than QuickBooks Desktop. Then over here, we have all the different entities within QuickBooks that we can access. We're going to access two of them today. We're going to access customers, and then we'll access invoices. Now, the principles that we end up using here, you could use to pull any number of entities from QuickBooks. You might want to pull bills or payments or deposits. We'll show you the basic premises here, but you can use these to play around with the different entities here in QuickBooks and pull whatever you want. It's just a matter of getting the data from QuickBooks that you want, formatting it in that XML language, and then sending it back to Zoho. All right, Now let's jump into the function itself. So I'm going to just go into editing my function here that's already written. Sort of feel like Julia Child. I already have a turkey ready that's been in the oven for 5 hours. Let's start by initializing our XML string. So we're going to create the initial record tag. Now, for making any of our API calls to QuickBooks, we're going to need our QuickBooks company ID. Now, I have that saved as a CRM org variable, mostly so that you guys don't see the ID right here, and Freddie doesn't have to keep blurring it out in post. But the way that you find this company ID, and I'm sorry, Freddie, you will have to blur this out once, but going to your QuickBooks account, coming here to Settings, and then clicking on Additional Info. And here you can see your company ID is... So I copy that. Then inside of the CRM, I come over to Developer Hub under Settings, go to Variables, and here I've created a variable called QuickBooks Company ID. And then I've given it a value. Now if we go back into our function, you use the zoho.crm.getOrg variable and then the API name of your org variable to add it to your list here. This is also very useful because now I don't have to go back into QuickBooks every time I want to make a new QuickBooks function. I can just pull my company ID from that list of variables. And if that company ID ever changes, or if I have to add a new QuickBooks instance, I don't have to go changing every single spot that I may have used that company ID. It all gets updated in one place. So now that we have our company ID, we can start to make queries to QuickBooks. So the way that QuickBooks likes to do it is in a way it's like a version of SQL or SQL if you've ever used a database like Zoho Analytics or Tableau or Postegri. There's a lot of different options. They have a very simple version of a query language that we're going to use here. So the way that you do it is by selecting items that you want from a particular entity, then you add the criteria for what filters you want to add with a where statement or where clause inside of your statement. So first up, we're going to need to get the customer that relates to our CRM customer. Now, the way that we're doing that is we're just going to do it by account name. Obviously, this requires that you have accounts in QuickBooks and CRM that have the same name, but you don't have to use account name. We're just going to use that here today. You could use some kind of ID number, or if there's a particular email address associated with an account that's also associated to your QuickBooks customer, you can use that as well, but we're just going to use the account name for today. So we're going to create our QuickBooks query. I'm going to select the columns ID and display name, or columns is probably a little bit of a misnomer. I'm going to select those data points of ID and display name from my customer database in QuickBooks, where the display name is equal to my account name. So this account name variable I have mapped in the arguments up above. So I created account name, and here I will set the argument value as accounts and then account ID. Oh, no, not ID. Account name. There we go. So it'll pull in the account name from the CRM record and then place it inside of this query. Now, it might be a little bit hard to tell just looking here, but you actually have to enclose that account name with single quotes. That's what QuickBooks wants to see. But of course, as we're writing in Deluge, in order to turn this all into a string of text, we have to have double quotes separating our hard-coded text values with our variable values. So it might look a little odd here, but we have to have a single quote, then a double quote, so that we can insert our account name variable, and then one more single quote enclosed in double quotes. It's a lot of quotes. And I know what you're thinking. I thought we were talking about invoices, not quotes. But to be serious, you do need to format this correctly, otherwise you'll get some errors back. Now, we take this query statement and we're going to add it to a map attached to a key called query. And that is going to be our parameter that we pass into our API call. So now to actually make the API call to QuickBooks, we are going to use the invoke URL task in Deluge that allows us to reach out side of Zoho to hit this third party. I'll go ahead and call the result of this query QB customers. And now I have 5 elements here that I have to include in my API call. First, I need the URL endpoint. This is the path that the API call takes to get to the QuickBooks database and navigate to the particular spot that it needs to go. So I have this set up to go through the query endpoint that I can find if I go back over to my QuickBooks API documentation and I come here to customer, and then under customer I can select query a customer, and I can take a look and see the example here is if I'm using a production account, I use https://quickbooks.api.intuit.com, or if I'm using a sandbox to test this out first, I would do https://sandbox-quickbooks.api.intuit.com. Then you follow the base URL up with /v3/company/ and then your realm ID or your company ID that we got in a previous step, /query, and then you can actually ignore the question mark and everything to the right because we're actually going to include that through this parameters portion. The other thing that you'll note is we have to specify a type of API call. So both of the API calls that we're going to make are going to be gets because we're not sending any data to QuickBooks. We're just trying to get data from QuickBooks. So we need to get in both of these instances. By default, QuickBooks API returns its data in an XML format that is frankly hard to read. So I want to create this headers setting inside of my invoke URL with a map that has the key of accept and the value of application/JSON. That way I can use all of my deluge.gets, .puts to manipulate and read the data in a much easier way. And then finally, we need a connection. And so this connection is one that I set up previously. We create that by going to our settings in the CRM, and under developer space or developer hub, we have connections. This is where we authorize that Deluge is allowed to make API calls to QuickBooks. I already have it set up here, but what you'll do when you're setting it up for the first time is you'll click on Create Connection. Then here under Default Services, you can just search for QuickBooks, select it, and then you'll need to enter a connection name. I could just do QBO. I already have one created where I just called it QuickBooks, and then using the scopes of whichever product you are using, we're using QuickBooks Accounting. We're not dealing with any payments here, so we'll just have this scope checked, but you can also check both. I'm just going to leave this one checked, and you will click Connect. Then this takes you to Zoho Flow. Zoho Flow is the program that is handling the actual sort of handshake between QuickBooks and Zoho. Now, I've already set one up earlier, so it's saying that I've already used a QuickBooks connection here. So if you're setting this up for the first time, what you'll see is just a box to initiate the authorization. That will then open up a new window that will prompt you to put in your QuickBooks username and password credentials to finalize the authorization and give Zoho full permission to pull and push data from QuickBooks. Now that we have that explained, let's head back into our Deluge code, and that's where we're using this QuickBooks connection here. Then we have the result coming back is saved to query QB customers. Now, I've already done a lot of the front work for you of kind of parsing through what the data looks like, but I can show you what it would look like over here back on our reference document for QuickBooks API. So here, I can see what would a customer return statement look like. Well, it would be a map with the key query response. Then inside of that is another key called customer. And then inside of that is a list of any customers that are returned as a result of my particular query criteria. So what I do back over here in the Deluge is I go one level in and check to make sure that I actually get something back in my query response. So I do query QB customers.get query response. Then I want to make sure that there actually is something there to work with so that this function doesn't break. So I'm going to use an if statement to check if my query response is not equal to null, meaning that it's not empty. There's at least something there. So then I'll get this list of customer record results by doing query response.getCustomer. Then I'm going to do a for each loop, meaning that it's going to execute whatever is in between these two brackets as many times as there are items in this list to sort through. So if my query happened to return 3 customers, this for each loop would run 3 times, one for each customer in that list. So for every customer in customer list, I'm doing another if statement here where I'm double checking if the display name of the customer in QuickBooks matches with my account name. Then I'm going to need to grab their QuickBooks customer ID in order to make my invoice query just a little bit later. So my QuickBooks customer ID I will get by calling the variable that I defined at the beginning of the for each loop. So in this case, it's customer.get, and then I just need this ID value, which you can see over here on a query response example. That ID is just some numerical value, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, whatever, that represents your customer's unique identifier inside of QuickBooks. Now, if I do successfully find something, then it means that it's time for us to get some invoices. So if my QuickBooks customer ID is not null, meaning I actually found one, then we're going to follow a very similar process we did for the customers, but now with the invoices. So my new QuickBooks query is going to select star from invoice. Now, using the star says, just give me back every possible piece of data associated with this record. This way, I can make decisions later on about which columns or I do or don't want to represent, and I can do all that down here instead of having to do it up here. So I'll say, select everything that you can get from the invoices where customer ref, which now if I go back to my API documentation and I scroll down to invoice and I take a look at what an invoice object contains, I can see that the invoice object has a value called customer ref. And that customer ref is a reference field that corresponds to the customer record that we looked up earlier in our function. And so what we want is to get invoices where the customer ref value is the same value as the ID of the customer that we picked just a little bit earlier in our function. So now that I have that in place, I'm going to put that query inside of a map again, add that as a parameter, end up actually using the same URL endpoint because their query language just uses whatever the from is to decide which section of QuickBooks to look at. So again, we're just looking at invoices. Then much the same way as I did with the customers, I'm going to define my query response, make sure that there actually is something in that query response, and assuming that there is, so if it's not equal to null, then we create our list of invoices. Now we're going to start building that XML list. So I'm going to go back over to my Zoho reference material, and we already created this first record tag all the way up at the top here, right, where we started our XML string. So now we need to add the row number opening tag. So to do that, I'm going to start a row count variable that's going to start at 0. And every time we go through a new invoice, we're going to add 1 to that counter. So now we start another for each loop, like we talked about before. So for each invoice in this invoice list variable that I have, I'm going to take my XML string that I've already added a little bit to, and I want to add onto what's already there. I don't want to replace everything. I want to keep adding onto it. So the way we do that in Deluge is we say a variable is equal to itself plus something else. That way it keeps adding to the end of the variable rather than replacing it. So XML string equals XML string plus we start our opening row tag, and then we have no or number equal to whatever the particular row count variable is. Now, something you might notice here is again, similar to the problem we have with the quotes and single quotes up in our customer query, is here we need to have double quotes around the number 0 or whatever number it is. But the problem is Deluge likes to use those double quotes to indicate whether or not we're hard coding a string value or separating it from a variable value. So we have to actually tell Deluge that we want this particular double quote to be literally used within a string of text, rather than using it to denote inside of the editor that we're switching in or out of a hard-coded text statement. So that's why we use this backslash in front of this double quote. And that way it's telling the Deluge editor, I want you to pretend that this is just literally inside of this overall string, right? So we have these double quotes on the outside, and then we have this one double quote on the inside that we want just literally in there, so we have to add that backslash. And so we have to do it over here as well, so that at the end, this value here of row number plus row count plus backslash double quote and then a closed arrow is going to end up looking like this over here on the left of just row no equals 0. Next, we're going to start adding our FL tags. All right, so remember that these FL tags, each one of them represents a column in the table that we're going to show in our related list. Here I've selected, as you already saw at the beginning of this video, I've decided to show the invoice number, the invoice transaction date, the total amount associated with the invoice, as well as the current balance of that invoice. We'll start with the invoice number, which I also wanted to turn into a hyperlink so that I could click on it and quickly hop to that invoice record inside of QuickBooks. So what I'm going to do is I need to, again, XML string equals XML string plus something new. We're going to do this !FL, so opening up a new FL tag. And then we have val, which is going to be the name of the column. So in this case, I want my first column to be called number. And notice I'm using the backslashes again so that I can enclose number inside of double quotes within the double quotes of the Deluge editor. Then we need to add this link value and set it equal to true. And then this URL, which equals, and now the nice thing about the way QuickBooks is set up is that this syntax of https://qbo.intuit.com/app/invoice $TXN ID equals, and then your invoice ID, as long as you're logged into QuickBooks, following that URL will take you to that invoice record. Regardless of, you don't have to put in a company ID or anything like that. It'll just use whoever you're logged in as to determine which organization you should be looking at. So I have that invoice ID added in here. Then we finally close the FL tag. So I know it's a lot, but this all the way to here constitutes just this part of our reference over here. Or if you look down, right, we're creating this whole segment. All right, now I actually want to have what is the value that is hyperlinked. This is where we want the invoice number to go. So here, because I'm still inside of my for each loop where invoice is the variable I've decided should represent a particular invoice record in this repeating list, I'm going to add in invoice.get, and then I need to know what is the name of the data point inside of QuickBooks. Well, it's doc number for that, and the way that I figured that out was by using the QuickBooks API reference. So again, here under the invoice object, I can look at all of these different attributes, and I know there is one here called doc number, right? So you can see this value doc number here, and it has a description here that this is the reference number for the transaction. So I'm going to pass in capital D, O, C, capital N, U, M, B, E, R, doc number into my little get statement here. So it will pull whatever the value of the doc number is from my invoice record. Then once I finish that, I close up that FL tag. Now I just repeat the same process with any other data points that I want. Fortunately, these are a little bit simpler because I don't need a hyperlink on each one of these. These can just be static text values. I don't need to be able to click into them. So here I'm going to do XML string equals XML string plus, let's add the date. So again, just add the date, and then inside of the invoice, it's under TXN or transaction date. Then I want to add 2 currency values. Now, inside of QuickBooks, if I take a look at an example invoice object, let me go back to query an invoice, and I look at the example here. Things like total amount and balance that I'm wanting to pull here, you can see that they are decimal values, meaning that 1, they don't have a dollar sign in front of them, and 2, if there's not a cent level, if it's just in, the 10 cents, so if it's like in this case, $150, or even if it was $150.50, it's only going to represent it to 1 decimal point because it doesn't want to add all the trailing zeros. So 2 things that I'm going to have to do with these currency fields that I want to use, total and balance, I have to add a dollar sign at the beginning, and I have to force round the numbers to 2 decimal places so that they look like your standard US currency denomination. So for that, I have my XML string. We start the FL tag, give the thing a value of total. Then after my closing caret here, I'm going to add the dollar sign before I add my invoice.getTotalAmount. And then I'm going to use this .round function inside of Deluge and give it a value of 2, indicating that I want it to round this decimal number to 2 decimal places. So even if that's going to leave zeros at the end, I want to see those zeros. So I do that for both my total and my balance. And once I'm done with the columns that I want to add here, I close out the row tag that I started up here. And then finally, we need to increase our row count variable by 1 so that the next iteration that this runs, this row count variable will be updated with the next number. Finally, once I've been through my entire list, so my for each loop is done, now we get to close off the last bit of our XML string. So remember, we put this record tag up here at the beginning, so now we just have to add a closing record tag here. Now notice, what I'm doing here is I've put it inside of an if statement saying only do this if the invoice list size is greater than 0, right? Because if the size of the list of invoices is 0, it means there were no invoices. We did find the customer, but we didn't find any invoices. So if this if condition is not met, meaning that the invoice list size is 0, then instead of all of the XML string I've been building, I want to actually replace it with a custom statement that's going to have an error message in the related list that will communicate to my user why they're not seeing any information on that table. So this is some syntax that isn't very well explicitly labeled in the Zoho documentation. This has mostly been found out through forum posts and just sort of investigations by the Zenatta team to figure out all the various little tags that you can use in these XML related lists. But we have this one where you have tag called error, and then you pass in a message tag to it with some statement here. So here I have an error message of no invoices related to this customer. And so you can see that I don't have XML string equals XML string plus, because in this instance, because something went wrong, I want to replace the whole string with just this particular error string. So that's what I'm doing here. Then follow down, maybe if some of you are cheating and looking ahead a little bit, you can see that I have another XML string replacement that's inside of an else statement saying no QuickBooks customer found. So this is in reference all the way up at the top. You remember that we checked that we actually got a response from our query QuickBooks customers, and we checked if the QuickBooks customer ID is not equal to null, then we did all the invoice stuff. In this case, we had something, so we're able to move through it. But this if statement connects down to this else statement here. So if I did not find a corresponding QuickBooks customer ID, then I want to return a different error message saying no QuickBooks customer found. Finally, after going through all of this, whatever's inside of that XML string variable, So it's either going to be that record tag, row tags, and FL tags ending with another record tag, or it's going to be one of these two error messages. One of those three options will be returned in this XML string variable. So once I have that in place, go ahead and save it. Then I need to give my custom related list a name. Again, I've already created mine over here, so I just called it QuickBooks Invoices. You can call it whatever you like. But once you do, voila, you now have this related list called QuickBooks Invoices with the columns of number, date, total, and balance, and with a hyperlink value taking you to that actual record. Now, when you first add this related list, it's going to default to placing it at the very bottom of your related lists. So to move it back up to the top, you'll come over here to related list, click on this little icon of sort of bullets and indents, and this will allow you to organize which related lists you want to see and in what order. So also, if you have just too many related lists and you have certain maybe features that you aren't using anymore, you can move ones that you don't need over into your unselected list section just to clean up maybe what you've been not using anymore, right? And then you could move any given related list up or down by selecting it here and then clicking the up or down arrows to move it. Now, you can't move anything up above notes. Notes has to be up at the top, but you can move stuff as close as that. So I'll go ahead and click save here, and this is where my invoice list appears right below my notes. Okay, I know that was a lot, but you are real troopers for sticking through. Trust me, watch this video a couple of times, not only because it'll increase our viewer count, but also I want you to be able to look through the code here with me and see what you can reverse engineer. I would love to be able to see you guys make more customized related lists. You don't have to necessarily use number, date, total, and balance. Let's say you didn't even want to look at invoices. You wanted to look at bills or payments. Then looking through and following the principles of checking the API reference documentation and being able to parse that data from the API calls and just making the API calls in the first place, you really are going to find yourself able to unlock a myriad of possibilities inside of your CRM through these custom related lists. As always, if you found this video helpful, we appreciate a like and subscribe here on our YouTube channel. You can also follow Zenatta Consulting on your favorite choice of podcast app, where we have the CRM Zen Show that follows all the latest Zoho news, as well as highlighting these tip videos and others like them. And if you ever want Zenatta Consulting's help setting up your Zoho system or implementing features like this one, you can head over to Zenatta.com, click on Book a Meeting, and meet with one of our sales team members. I've been Greg Belknap, Director of Development here at Zenatta Consulting. We'll see you in the next video.